Captain Sarah Mitchell gripped the controls of her Black Hawk helicopter as it cut through the thick Afghan morning air. The rotors beat steadily above her head, a sound that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat after 3 years of flying transport missions. Below her, the rugged mountains stretched endlessly, their peaks catching the first light of dawn. Just a transport pilot, she muttered to herself, repeating the words she'd heard countless times from the combat units she ferried around. It wasn't said with malice, but Sarah felt the sting anyway. While the infantry soldiers and special forces operators got the glory and recognition, she was seen as nothing more than a glorified taxi driver with wings. Sarah had joined the army to prove herself, to show that a woman from a small Texas town could handle anything the military threw at her. She'd graduated top of her flight school class, mastered every aircraft in the fleet, and had a perfect safety record. Yet here she was, 3 years later, still hauling supplies and personnel from base to base while watching others get the dangerous, important missions. The radio crackled to life, interrupting her thoughts. Blackbird 6-2, this is Copper Base. We have a priority transport mission for you. Sarah pressed the transmit button. Copy, Copper Base, send details. You'll be picking up SEAL Team Alpha from Forward Operating Base Falcon and transporting them to a classified location. Mission briefing upon arrival at FOB Falcon. Sarah's pulse quickened slightly. SEAL teams meant serious business, not the routine supply runs she was used to. Roger that, Copper Base, ETA to FOB Falcon in 20 minutes. As she banked the helicopter toward the coordinates, Sarah couldn't help but wonder what kind of mission required a SEAL team. These elite operators only got called in for the most critical situations. Maybe this time she'd be doing something that actually mattered. FOB Falcon appeared on the horizon, a collection of tan buildings and defensive walls carved into a valley between 2 mountain ridges. Sarah brought the Black Hawk down smoothly on the landing pad, her rotors kicking up clouds of dust that had become a permanent fixture of every landing in Afghanistan. 6 men in full combat gear jogged toward her aircraft. Even with their faces partially hidden behind tactical gear, Sarah could tell these weren't regular soldiers. They moved with a precision and confidence that came only from years of the most demanding training. Their equipment was top tier, their weapons pristine, and every movement deliberate. The team leader approached her window and gestured for her to cut the engines. Sarah complied, and the sudden silence felt strange after hours of rotor noise. The SEAL removed his helmet, revealing a weathered face with intense blue eyes and a thick beard. He looked to be in his late 30s with the kind of presence that commanded respect without saying a word. "Captain Mitchell?" he asked, his voice deep and authoritative. "That's me," Sarah replied, removing her own helmet and letting her brown hair fall to her shoulders. "I'm Commander Jake Harrison. We need to talk before we take off." Sarah climbed down from the cockpit, curious about why a mission briefing couldn't happen over the radio. Commander Harrison led her away from the helicopter, out of earshot of his team members who were loading gear into the cargo bay. "What I'm about to tell you is classified at the highest levels," Harrison began, his expression serious. "We're going after a high-value target who's been planning attacks on coalition forces. Intel suggests he's holed up in a compound about 60 miles northeast of here, near the Pakistani border." Sarah nodded, trying to appear nonchalant despite her racing heart. This was exactly the kind of mission she'd dreamed of being part of. "The thing is," Harrison continued, "this isn't a standard insertion. The terrain is extremely hostile, and we're going to be operating in an area with heavy Taliban presence. There's a good chance we'll encounter resistance on the way in or out." "I can handle it," Sarah said quickly, perhaps too quickly. Harrison studied her for a moment. "I've read your file, Captain. You're an excellent pilot with an impressive record. But this isn't about flying skill. If things go wrong out there, you might be our only way home. Are you prepared for that kind of responsibility?" The weight of his words settled on Sarah's shoulders. This wasn't just about proving herself anymore. 6 lives would depend on her ability to get them out of a potentially deadly situation. "I won't let you down, Commander," she said, meeting his gaze directly. Harrison nodded slowly. "Good. Because where we're going, there's no room for error." As they walked back to the helicopter, Sarah's mind raced with questions and possibilities. She'd wanted a chance to prove herself, and now she had it. But as she watched the SEAL team make final preparations, checking weapons and communications equipment with practiced efficiency, she realized this mission would test her in ways she'd never imagined. The team climbed aboard, and Sarah strapped herself back into the pilot seat. As she started the engines and felt the familiar vibration of the rotors spinning up, she took a deep breath. This was her moment to show that she was more than just a transport pilot. Commander Harrison's voice came through her headset as they lifted off. "Remember, Captain, once we're inserted, maintain radio silence unless it's an emergency. We'll call for extraction when the mission is complete." "Copy that, Commander," Sarah replied, banking the helicopter toward the mountains. As Phobie Falcon disappeared behind them and they headed into increasingly hostile territory, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this mission would change everything. She just didn't know how right she was or how much she would be tested before it was over. The mountains grew taller and more forbidding as they flew deeper into enemy territory, and Sarah gripped the controls tighter, ready for whatever lay ahead. The helicopter flew deeper into the mountains, following a winding path through valleys that seemed to close in around them with each passing mile. Sarah kept the aircraft low, using the terrain to mask their approach from any enemy radar or observers. The landscape below was harsh and unforgiving, with rocky outcroppings and sparse vegetation that spoke of a land where survival required constant vigilance. Commander Harrison sat directly behind her, occasionally pointing out landmarks or potential threats through the headset. Despite his serious demeanor during the briefing, Sarah noticed he had a calm presence that seemed to settle the entire team. The other 5 SEALs sat quietly in the cargo bay, each lost in their own pre-mission routines. "Target area coming up in 5 minutes." Harrison's voice crackled through the headset. "There's a flat area about half a mile from the compound where you can set us down." Sarah studied the terrain ahead, noting the challenging landing zone. The flat area Harrison mentioned was barely large enough for her helicopter, surrounded by steep rock walls that would make the approach tricky. But she'd landed in worse conditions before. "I see it, Commander. Wind patterns look stable. Should be a clean insertion." As they approached the landing zone, Sarah noticed something that made her stomach tighten. Smoke was rising from somewhere beyond the ridge where the target compound was supposed to be. "That wasn't part of the mission briefing. Commander, are you seeing that smoke?" Harrison was already scanning the area with binoculars. "Roger. Could be cooking fires, but it's more than we expected. Change of plans. Set us down behind that rocky outcrop to the east. We'll approach on foot from there." Sarah adjusted her approach, bringing the Black Hawk down in a tight space between 2 large boulders. The landing was smooth despite the challenging terrain, and she felt a small surge of pride as the team prepared to disembark. "Good flying, Captain," one of the SEALs said as he passed her seat. That was a tight squeeze. The team moved with practiced efficiency, unloading their gear and checking their equipment one final time. Commander Harrison approached Sarah's window before leaving. "We'll be back in 6 hours, maybe less if everything goes according to plan. Keep the bird ready for a quick extraction." "What if you're not back in 6 hours?" Sarah asked. Harrison's expression darkened slightly. "Then assume we're in trouble and call for backup. But don't leave without direct orders from command." With that, the 6 SEALs disappeared into the rocky terrain, moving like shadows despite their heavy gear. Sarah watched until she could no longer see them, then settled in for what she hoped would be a routine wait. The first few hours passed quietly. Sarah performed routine maintenance checks on her aircraft, monitored radio communications, and kept watch for any signs of enemy activity. The mountains around her were eerily silent except for the occasional distant sound of aircraft or the call of a bird. As the 4th hour approached, Sarah began to feel restless. She'd heard no communication from Harrison's team, which was normal according to their radio silence protocol, but something felt wrong. The smoke she'd seen earlier had grown thicker, and she could now hear the distant sound of gunfire echoing through the valleys. Her radio suddenly burst to life with frantic chatter from other coalition forces in the area. All units, this is Overwatch. We have multiple Taliban forces converging on Grid 47 Delta. Heavy resistance reported. Any units in the area, please respond." Sarah's blood ran cold. Grid 47 Delta was exactly where she'd dropped off the SEAL team. She grabbed her radio to respond, but remembered Harrison's orders about maintaining radio silence. She was caught between protocol and her growing concern for the team's safety. The gunfire in the distance grew more intense, and Sarah could now see muzzle flashes lighting up the mountainside. Whatever the SEAL team had walked into, it was much bigger than anyone had anticipated. Her decision was made when her radio crackled with a weak, static-filled transmission. "Blackbird, this is Alpha Leader, taking heavy fire. Compound was a trap. Need immediate extraction. The transmission cut off abruptly, leaving Sarah staring at her radio in shock. Commander Harrison's voice had been strained and desperate, completely different from the calm professional she'd spoken with just hours earlier. Sarah fired up her engines without hesitation. Protocol or no protocol, her team was in trouble and she was their only way out. As the rotor spun up to full speed, she tried to raise Harrison on the radio again. Alpha Leader, this is Blackbird 6-2. I copy your distress call. What's your location? Static. Then faintly, pinned down compound, northeast wall. Multiple hostiles. Can't reach extraction point. Sarah lifted off immediately, pushing the Black Hawk to its maximum speed as she raced toward the target compound. The landscape below was now alive with movement. She could see vehicles racing along mountain roads and groups of armed men moving through the valleys. The SEAL team had definitely stirred up a hornet's nest. As she crested the final ridge, Sarah got her first clear view of the compound. It was much larger than the intelligence reports had indicated, with multiple buildings and defensive positions. Smoke and fire marked several locations where explosions had occurred, and she could see muzzle flashes from at least a dozen different positions. The compound was crawling with Taliban fighters, far more than a six-man SEAL team could handle alone. Sarah realized with growing dread that this hadn't been an intelligence mission at all. The SEALs had walked into a carefully prepared ambush. She spotted movement near the northeast wall of the compound and caught a glimpse of American camouflage uniforms. The SEAL team was pinned down behind a low wall, surrounded by enemy fighters who were closing in from multiple directions. Sarah keyed her radio again. Alpha Leader, I have eyes on your position. I'm coming in for extraction. Harrison's response was immediate and urgent. Negative, Blackbird, too hot. Fall back and call for air support. But Sarah could see that there wasn't time for air support. The enemy was closing in, and in a few minutes the SEAL team would be completely overrun. She was their only chance. Sorry, Commander, she muttered to herself. But you said I might be your only way home. Sarah put the Black Hawk into a steep dive toward the compound, her heart pounding as she prepared to attempt the most dangerous rescue of her career. Sarah dove the Black Hawk toward the compound, her hands steady on the controls despite the chaos erupting around her. Bullets whined past the aircraft as Taliban fighters turned their attention to this new threat. The helicopter's armored hull could withstand small arms fire, but Sarah knew that wouldn't last long if they brought out heavier weapons. She could see the SEAL team more clearly now. 4 men were positioned behind a crumbling stone wall, returning fire at multiple enemy positions, but she could only count 4 figures, not 6. 2 members of the team were missing, and her heart sank as she realized what that might mean. Alpha Leader, I count 4 of you. Where are the others? She called over the radio. Harrison's voice came back strained and breathless. Johnson's hit bad. Martinez is carrying him. They're in the building behind us, but we can't reach them. Sarah's mind raced as she assessed the situation. The landing zone near the wall was too small and too exposed. Enemy fighters were positioned on rooftops and behind cover, making any landing attempt extremely dangerous. But leaving 2 men behind wasn't an option. She pulled the helicopter up sharply, circling the compound while she formulated a plan. The building Harrison mentioned was a 2-story structure with a flat roof. It was risky, but it might be their only chance. Commander, can you get to the roof of that building? Negative. Too much fire between us and the building. We're pinned down. Sarah gritted her teeth. She'd have to create a distraction. Flying low over the compound, she used the helicopter's rotor wash to kick up clouds of dust and debris, temporarily blinding the enemy fighters. It was a dangerous maneuver that brought her well within range of their weapons, but it gave the SEAL team a few precious seconds of cover. Move now, she called over the radio. Harrison and his 3 men sprinted from their position, using the dust cloud as concealment. Sarah watched helplessly as enemy fire erupted from multiple positions, tracer rounds lighting up the swirling dust. One of the SEALs stumbled but kept running, supported by a teammate. They reached the building just as the dust began to settle. Sarah could see Taliban fighters moving to surround the structure, cutting off any escape routes. She had minutes, maybe less, before the situation became hopeless. Bringing the Black Hawk around to the back of the building, Sarah lined up for an approach to the roof. The space was barely large enough for her aircraft, with a satellite dish and various equipment creating obstacles she'd have to avoid. But it was their only chance. As she descended toward the roof, automatic weapons fire erupted from the surrounding buildings. The helicopter shuddered as bullets struck the fuselage, and warning lights began flashing on her instrument panel. She ignored them, focusing entirely on the delicate landing. The skids touched down with a grinding sound as they scraped against the concrete roof. Immediately, the building's door burst open and 2 SEALs emerged, one carrying a wounded teammate over his shoulder. Behind them came Harrison and another operator, laying down covering fire as more Taliban fighters appeared on nearby rooftops. "Get him aboard," Harrison shouted over the rotor noise. The wounded SEAL Johnson was unconscious and bleeding heavily from a leg wound. Martinez and the others loaded him into the cargo bay while Sarah kept the engines at full power, ready for immediate takeoff. "We're aboard," Harrison called out. "Get us out of here!" Sarah pulled pitch immediately, lifting off the roof just as rocket-propelled grenades began streaking toward their position. One exploded against the building's wall where they'd been seconds before, showering debris across the roof. But their troubles were far from over. As they climbed away from the compound, Sarah could see more Taliban fighters positioned throughout the valley. Vehicles were racing along the mountain roads trying to intercept their escape route. Worse, she could hear radio chatter indicating that enemy forces had anti-aircraft weapons in the area. "Multiple SAM sites active," Harrison reported from the back, monitoring enemy communications. "They're trying to box us in." Sarah's training kicked in as she began evasive maneuvers, using the mountainous terrain to break line of sight with potential missile sites. She flew low through valleys, pulling sharp turns around rocky outcroppings, and varying her altitude constantly to make targeting difficult. Behind her, the SEAL team worked frantically to treat Johnson's wounds. Sarah could hear them calling out medical instructions and requesting updates on his vital signs. The man was losing too much blood, and they needed to get him to a medical facility immediately. "How's he doing back there?" Sarah called out. "He's stabilized for now, but he needs surgery," Martinez replied. "How long to the nearest hospital?" Sarah's heart sank. The nearest coalition medical facility was 40 minutes away, and they'd have to cross the most dangerous part of enemy territory to reach it. With damaged systems and limited fuel, she wasn't sure they'd make it. "I'm taking us to FOB Falcon," she announced. "It's closer and they have a medical unit." "Negative," Harrison interjected. "Falcon's been hit. Taliban forces overran the outer perimeter an hour ago. The base is under siege." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. FOB Falcon had been their fallback position, their safe haven. If it was under attack, their options were severely limited. She checked her instruments and made a quick calculation. They had enough fuel to reach one of 2 locations: a small coalition outpost called Firebase Echo, or they could attempt to make it all the way back to the main base at Bagram. Firebase Echo was closer but had minimal medical facilities. Bagram had everything Johnson needed but was much further away. "Commander, I need a decision. Echo or Bagram?" Harrison was quiet for a moment, weighing the options. Sarah could hear Johnson's labored breathing over the intercom, and she knew time was running out. "Echo," Harrison decided. "If we try for Bagram and don't make it, we lose everyone." Sarah banked the helicopter toward Firebase Echo, pushing the damaged aircraft as hard as she dared. Warning lights continued to flash, indicating multiple system failures, but the engines were still running strong. As they flew through a narrow mountain pass, Sarah's worst fears were realized. The radar warning receiver began screaming, indicating that they were being targeted by a surface-to-air missile system. "Missile lock," she called out. "Hold on!" Sarah threw the Black Hawk into a violent, evasive maneuver, just as a missile streaked past their position, exploding harmlessly against the mountainside. But she could see more launches, and her damaged helicopter was running out of defensive options. "There," Harrison pointed through the windscreen. "Firebase Echo, 2 o'clock. Sarah could see the small outpost in the distance, but between them and safety lay the most dangerous few minutes of their lives. Firebase Echo sat on a hilltop like a small fortress, its defensive walls and guard towers barely visible through the haze of distance and smoke. Sarah could see it clearly now, but the final approach looked like flying through hell itself. Taliban forces had positioned themselves along the route, and she could already see muzzle flashes from multiple weapons positions. Another missile warning screamed in her headset. Sarah threw the Black Hawk into a sharp dive, using a rocky ridge as cover just as a second surface-to-air missile exploded where they'd been moments before. The shockwave rocked the helicopter violently, and she heard something important break in the engine compartment. Engine 2 is running rough, she called back to Harrison. We're losing power. Behind her, Johnson's condition was deteriorating rapidly. Martinez was working frantically to keep pressure on the wound while another SEAL administered IV fluids. Every bump and maneuver of the helicopter made their job harder, but Sarah had no choice but to keep evading enemy fire. The helicopter shuddered as small arms fire peppered the fuselage. Sarah could hear the distinctive ping of bullets hitting metal, and she prayed nothing vital would be hit. They were so close to safety, but these final few miles felt like the longest of her life. Firebase Echo. This is Blackbird 6-2 with wounded SEALs requesting immediate medical assistance and emergency landing clearance. Sarah transmitted on the emergency frequency. The response came back immediately. Blackbird 6-2, Firebase Echo. You're cleared for emergency landing on Pad 2. Be advised, we're taking mortar fire from the south ridge. Approach from the north. Sarah adjusted her flight path, swinging wide to approach from the specified direction. As she did, she could see the firebase was indeed under attack. Explosions bloomed along the defensive perimeter, and she could see soldiers running between positions, returning fire at distant enemy positions. The mortar fire was getting closer to the landing pads. Sarah watched as one round exploded just 50 meters from where she needed to land, throwing dirt and debris high into the air. The timing would have to be perfect. 30 seconds out, she announced to her passengers. Harrison moved forward to the cockpit. Captain, as soon as we touch down, we'll get Johnson to the medics. You need to shut down and get your bird checked out. You've taken a lot of damage. Sarah nodded, but her attention was focused on the rapidly approaching firebase. She could see medical personnel running toward the landing pad, ready to receive their wounded passenger. Everything depended on the next few moments. As they descended toward Pad 2, another mortar round exploded nearby, close enough to rock the helicopter. Sarah fought to maintain control as debris rained down around them. The landing pad was scarred with fresh craters, making the approach even more challenging. The skids touched down with a hard thump, and immediately the SEAL team was in motion. They had Johnson out of the cargo bay and onto a stretcher within seconds, rushing him toward the firebase's medical facility. Sarah watched them disappear into the bunker-like structure, praying they weren't too late. She began shutting down the engines when Harrison appeared at her window again. Good flying, Captain. You saved our lives out there. Before Sarah could respond, an explosion much closer than the others shook the entire firebase. Alarms began wailing, and she could hear shouted orders over the base's communication system. All personnel to defensive positions. Enemy ground assault imminent! Harrison's expression hardened. We've got bigger problems. The Taliban are launching a major attack. Sarah looked around at the firebase's defenses. It was a small outpost, designed more for observation and communication than prolonged combat. If the enemy was launching a ground assault, the defenders would be vastly outnumbered. How many troops does this place have? She asked. Maybe 30 soldiers plus a few support personnel, Harrison replied grimly. Not nearly enough if this is a coordinated attack. As if to emphasize his point, machine gun fire erupted from the perimeter, and Sarah could see tracer rounds streaking through the growing darkness. The enemy was closer than she'd realized. Harrison was already moving, gathering his remaining team members who had returned from the medical facility. Johnson's in surgery, but the docs think he'll make it, he reported. Right now, we need to help defend this place. Sarah made a quick decision. My helicopter's damaged, but the weapon systems are still functional. I can provide air support. Negative, Captain. Your bird's too shot up. One more hit and you'll be walking home. But Sarah was already running her pre-flight checks again. The engines were rough but still operational, and her targeting systems showed green lights. She'd never fired the helicopter's weapons in combat before, but she'd trained extensively on the systems. With respect, Commander, this firebase won't hold without air support. Your team knows ground combat, but this is what I do. Harrison studied her for a moment, perhaps seeing something new in her eyes. The uncertain transport pilot was gone, replaced by someone who had been tested in the fire of combat and emerged stronger. All right, Captain, but stay high and keep moving. Don't give them an easy target. Sarah fired up the engines as Harrison and his men ran toward the defensive positions. The firebase was now fully engaged in combat, with enemy forces attacking from three sides. She could see muzzle flashes in the darkness as Taliban fighters advanced up the hillside. Lifting off from the landing pad, Sarah climbed to a tactical altitude and began searching for targets. Her night vision systems revealed dozens of enemy fighters moving through the rocks below, many carrying heavy weapons that could devastate the firebase's defenders. She lined up on a group of fighters setting up a mortar position and squeezed the trigger. The helicopter's cannon roared to life, sending a stream of high-explosive rounds into the enemy position. The mortar crew disappeared in a cloud of smoke and debris. For the next hour, Sarah flew a deadly dance around the firebase, using her helicopter's superior firepower and mobility to break up enemy attacks before they could reach the perimeter. She destroyed weapons positions, scattered advancing infantry, and provided covering fire for the defenders. But the helicopter was taking more damage with each pass. Bullet holes appeared in the windscreen. Warning lights multiplied on her instrument panel, and she could smell smoke in the cockpit. The enemy had brought portable anti-aircraft weapons, and they were getting closer to bringing her down with each attack run. During a brief lull in the fighting, Harrison's voice crackled over the radio. "Blackbird, we've got reinforcements inbound. A full Marine company is 30 minutes out." 30 minutes. Sarah looked at her fuel gauge and system status. She wasn't sure the helicopter would last another 30 minutes of combat. But as she watched the defenders below continuing their desperate fight, she knew she had to try. The enemy launched another assault, this one larger and more coordinated than the previous attacks. Sarah dove back into the fight, determined to hold the line until help arrived. The largest Taliban assault yet was building in the darkness below Firebase Echo. Through her night vision, Sarah could see enemy fighters moving in coordinated groups, carrying rocket launchers and heavy machine guns. This wasn't the disorganized attack of desperate fighters. This was a well-planned military operation designed to overrun the small outpost. Sarah's helicopter was barely holding together. The engines were running rough. Hydraulic fluid was leaking from multiple systems, and half her warning lights were red. But the weapon systems were still functional, and that was all that mattered right now. "Blackbird, this is Echo Base," came the urgent radio call. "We've got approximately 200 enemy fighters moving up the south slope. They're massing for a final assault. 200 fighters against 30 defenders." Sarah did the math and didn't like the result. Even with her air support, those odds were overwhelming. "Copy, Echo Base, I see them. Beginning attack run." Sarah lined up on the largest concentration of enemy forces and opened fire with everything she had. The helicopter's cannon and rockets lit up the mountainside, scattering the attackers and buying precious time. But for every group she broke up, 2 more seemed to take their place. As she banked around for another pass, a rocket-propelled grenade streaked past her cockpit, close enough that she could feel the heat. The enemy was learning her attack patterns and adapting their defenses. "Sarah," Harrison's voice cut through the radio chatter. It was the first time he'd used her first name, and the urgency in his tone made her stomach clench. "We've lost contact with Martinez and Thompson on the east wall. Can you check their position?" Sarah immediately flew toward the eastern defensive position, her heart pounding. Through her night vision, she could see 2 figures lying motionless behind their fighting position. Enemy fighters were already moving to exploit the gap in the perimeter. 2 men down on the east wall, she reported, her voice tight with emotion. "Enemy forces are breaking through." She dove toward the breach, firing at the advancing Taliban fighters. Several went down, but more kept coming. The firebase's defenders were being overwhelmed, and Sarah realized with growing despair that her ammunition was running low. "Echo Base, what's the ETA on those Marines?" she called desperately. 15 minutes out, but we're not sure we can hold that long." 15 minutes might as well have been 15 hours. Sarah could see enemy fighters inside the firebase perimeter now, engaging the defenders in close combat. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Then she heard Harrison's voice over the radio, calm despite the chaos around him. "All Echo Base personnel, this is Alpha Leader. We're falling back to the command bunker. Prepare for final defensive positions." Sarah's blood ran cold. The final defensive positions meant they were preparing for a last stand. Once the defenders were pushed back to the command bunker, it would only be a matter of time before they were overrun completely. She had to do something. But what? Her helicopter was nearly out of ammunition, dangerously low on fuel and falling apart around her. But then an idea formed in her mind, crazy and desperate, but possibly their only chance. "Commander Harrison, this is Sarah. I need you to get everyone into the command bunker and seal it tight." "What are you planning, Captain?" Sarah's voice was steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to attempt. "I'm going to crash this bird right on top of the enemy assault force. The explosion should buy you enough time for the Marines to arrive. Absolutely not. Harrison's response was immediate and fierce. Find another way! But Sarah could see there was no other way. Enemy fighters were swarming over the firebase, and the defenders had less than 5 minutes before they'd be completely overwhelmed. Her helicopter carried hundreds of gallons of aviation fuel and several remaining rockets. If she could guide it into the center of the enemy formation, "There is no other way, Jake," she said, using his first name for the first time. "Tell Johnson I kept my promise. I didn't let you down." Before Harrison could respond, Sarah began her final approach. She aimed the crippled helicopter at the largest concentration of enemy fighters, just outside the command bunker where they were preparing to launch their final assault. At the last second, as Taliban fighters scattered and dove for cover, Sarah pulled up hard on the collective and threw herself out of the cockpit. The helicopter continued forward on momentum, crashing into the enemy formation in a massive explosion that lit up the entire mountainside. Sarah hit the ground hard, rolling down a rocky slope as debris rained around her. Her head struck a boulder and darkness closed in around her consciousness. The last thing she heard was the sound of Marine helicopters approaching in the distance. When Sarah regained consciousness, she was lying in a medical tent with bandages covering multiple cuts and bruises. Her head throbbed and every muscle in her body ached, but she was alive. "About time you woke up," a familiar voice said from beside her cot. Sarah turned her head, wincing at the pain, to see Commander Harrison sitting in a chair next to her bed. His arm was in a sling and he had a bandage over one eye, but he was smiling. "The firebase," she asked weakly. "Secure. The Marines arrived just after your fireworks display and mopped up what was left of the enemy force. Your little stunt broke their assault completely." Sarah tried to sit up but immediately regretted it as the world spun around her. "Johnson? He's going to make it. Full recovery expected. Martinez and Thompson too, though they'll be out of action for a while." Sarah nodded, relief flooding through her. Everyone had made it home alive. "You know," Harrison continued, his tone serious now, "what you did back there, that wasn't the action of just a transport pilot. That was the kind of courage and sacrifice we expect from the very best operators." Sarah met his gaze, seeing something new in his eyes. Respect. Recognition. The acknowledgement she'd been seeking for so long, earned not through politics or favoritism, but through actions under fire. "I told you I wouldn't let you down," she said quietly. Harrison stood up, preparing to leave. "No, Captain Mitchell. You definitely did not let us down. In fact, I have a feeling this is just the beginning for you." As he walked away, Sarah closed her eyes and smiled despite the pain. She was no longer just a transport pilot. She had become something more. 3 months later, Sarah stood in the briefing room at Bagram Air Base wearing fresh flight gear and captain's bars that somehow felt different now. The room was filled with special operations personnel, intelligence officers and senior commanders, all gathered for what was being called the most important mission briefing of the year. Colonel Matthews, the base commander, stood at the front of the room holding a folder marked with the highest classification level. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you're about to hear does not leave this room. 3 days ago, our intelligence assets confirmed the location of Khalil Rahman, the mastermind behind the coordinated attacks on our forward operating bases." Sarah's pulse quickened. Rahman was the high-value target that Harrison's original mission had been designed to capture. The man whose compound had turned out to be an elaborate trap, nearly costing 6 lives. "Rahman has made a critical mistake," the colonel continued. "He's moved to a new location, believing we still think he's dead after the compound explosion. He's wrong. We know exactly where he is, and this time, we're going to get him." The colonel's eyes swept the room before settling on Sarah. "This mission will require the kind of precision flying and tactical thinking that goes beyond standard operating procedures. Captain Mitchell, you'll be leading the aviation element. Leading. Not supporting, not transporting, but leading." Sarah felt a surge of pride and determination as she stepped forward to accept the mission folder. The plan was complex, but elegant. Rahman was hiding in a mountain compound accessible only by helicopter, surrounded by loyal fighters who would defend him to the death. But intelligence indicated he had a weakness. Every few days, he traveled to a small village to visit his family, using a predictable route through a narrow valley. Sarah would lead a formation of 3 helicopters carrying 2 SEAL teams and a special intelligence unit. They would intercept Rahman's convoy in the valley, capture him alive if possible, and extract before enemy reinforcements could arrive. Commander Harrison approached her after the briefing, his injuries from Firebase Echo now fully healed. Feels different, doesn't it? Being the one everyone's counting on instead of just along for the ride. Sarah nodded, studying the mission maps. I won't lie, it's intimidating. But after what we went through at Echo, I know what I'm capable of. Harrison smiled. We all do. That's why you're leading this mission instead of flying back up for someone else. The next morning, Sarah conducted final pre-flight checks on her new helicopter, a state-of-the-art Black Hawk equipped with the latest avionics and weapons systems. This wasn't the battle-damaged aircraft she'd sacrificed at Firebase Echo, but a pristine machine that represented trust in her abilities. Johnson appeared at her aircraft, walking with only a slight limp from his leg injury. Mind if I tag along, Captain? I owe Rahman for this permanent reminder, he said, tapping his leg. Wouldn't have it any other way, Sarah replied. Just try to keep the bleeding to a minimum this time. As the 3 helicopters lifted off in formation, Sarah felt a calm confidence that had been missing during her previous missions. She was no longer trying to prove herself. She had already proven what she was capable of. Now she was simply doing what she did best. The flight to the intercept point went smoothly, with all 3 aircraft maintaining perfect formation through the challenging mountain terrain. Sarah's navigation was flawless, bringing them to the designated position exactly on schedule. Target convoy approaching from the north, reported the intelligence specialist monitoring radio intercepts. 3 vehicles, estimated 15 personnel including the primary target. Sarah positioned her formation in the valley, using the terrain to remain hidden until the last possible moment. Through her binoculars, she could see dust clouds in the distance marking the convoy's approach. All units, this is Blackbird Actual, she called over the radio, using her new call sign. Target convoy in sight. Begin approach. The 3 helicopters rose from concealment simultaneously, appearing in front of the convoy like mechanical birds of prey. The lead vehicle immediately attempted to turn around, but Sarah had anticipated this. Her second helicopter was already moving to block the valley's exit. Convoy is stopped, Harrison reported from the lead SEAL team. Beginning approach. What followed was a textbook special operations capture mission. The SEAL teams fast roped down from their helicopters with practiced precision, securing the convoy before Rahman's bodyguards could mount effective resistance. Within minutes, the terrorist leader was in custody, his laptop and documents secured as valuable intelligence assets. Package secured, Harrison reported. Ready for extraction. Sarah brought her helicopter down in the valley floor, watching as the SEAL teams loaded their prisoner and captured materials. Rahman was a small, unremarkable-looking man who seemed almost insignificant compared to the chaos he had caused. But his capture would save countless lives and deal a major blow to terrorist operations in the region. As they lifted off for the return flight to Bagram, Sarah reflected on how much had changed since that first mission months ago. She was still flying the same basic aircraft, still transporting personnel from point A to point B. But everything else was different. Nice work, Captain, Harrison said over the intercom. Clean, professional, exactly by the book. Sarah smiled as she guided the formation through the mountains toward home. Just doing my job, Commander. But they both knew it was much more than that. Sarah had transformed from someone seeking respect into someone who commanded it naturally. The mission's success wasn't just about capturing a high-value target. It was proof that she had become the kind of pilot and leader that others could count on when everything was on the line. 3 hours later, as Sarah shut down her engines on the tarmac at Bagram, she was approached by Colonel Matthews himself. Outstanding work, Captain. Rahman is already providing valuable intelligence, and your mission execution was flawless. The colonel paused, studying her with an appraising look. I'm recommending you for promotion to major and assignment to our Special Operations Aviation Unit. How does that sound? Sarah looked around at her crew, at Harrison and his SEAL team, at the helicopters that had become an extension of her own capabilities. 6 months ago, she had been just a transport pilot, flying routine missions and dreaming of something more. Now she was something she had never imagined possible. A leader whom others trusted with their lives. A pilot whose skills had been proven in the crucible of combat. And an officer whose career was just beginning to reach its true potential. It sounds perfect, sir, she replied. meaning every word. As she walked away from her aircraft for the last time as a captain, Sarah knew that the woman who had once felt overlooked and undervalued was gone forever. In her place stood someone who had discovered that respect wasn't given. It was earned through courage, competence, and the willingness to risk everything for the people who counted on you. The transport pilot had become a warrior, and her story was just beginning.